In the winter of 1867, construction foreman Samuel Hartwell sent his final telegraph from the Union Pacific's Camp 17, nestled deep in Utah's Wasatch Mountains. The message contained only 7 words: supply shortages critical, men eating each other. 3 days later, when the rescue expedition finally reached the isolated work camp through 12 feet of snow, they found the cook fires still burning, steam rising from massive iron cauldrons filled with what appeared to be stew. But of the 127 workers who had been stationed there, only 18 remained alive, and they were discovered huddled in the supply shed, their eyes wild with terror, refusing to speak about what had sustained them through the brutal mountain winter. The railroad company immediately sealed all records of Camp 17, and for over a century, families of the missing workers were told their loved ones had simply wandered off into the wilderness. But recently discovered company correspondence reveals a horror so systematic, so carefully orchestrated, that it challenges everything we thought we knew about America's westward expansion. Before we continue with the story of Camp 17 and the men who disappeared into those boiling cauldrons, I want you to take a moment to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We're about to uncover one of the most disturbing episodes in American railroad history, and I'd love to know which state you're listening from in the comments below. The truth about what happened in those Utah mountains during the winter of 1867 would remain buried beneath layers of corporate secrecy and government denial for generations. But the evidence we've uncovered paints a picture of calculated brutality that makes the Donner Party look like a Sunday picnic. Camp 17 represented everything ambitious and ruthless about America's race to complete the Transcontinental Railroad. Established in September 1867 along a treacherous stretch of track through Utah's Wasatch Range, the camp housed 127 men tasked with blasting through solid granite and laying rails across terrain that had claimed countless lives before them. The Union Pacific Railroad, locked in fierce competition with the Central Pacific to claim the most lucrative government subsidies, had pushed construction deeper into the mountains than any sensible engineer would recommend, driven by the promise of $48,000 per mile of track laid through mountainous terrain, nearly 3 times the compensation for plains construction. The camp itself was a testament to industrial determination and human desperation. Canvas tents and hastily constructed wooden barracks dotted a narrow valley between towering peaks that rose over 8,000 feet above sea level, while the constant thunder of dynamite echoed off canyon walls as work crews blasted their way through ancient stone formations that had stood unchanged since before human memory. The site had been chosen not for its habitability, but for its strategic position along the surveyed route, forcing the workers to carve their living space from a landscape that seemed actively hostile to human presence. Most of the workers were Irish immigrants fleeing the lingering effects of the Great Famine, joined by discharged Civil War veterans who carried the psychological scars of battles like Gettysburg and Antietam, and freed slaves seeking opportunity in the expanding West, where the color of a man's skin mattered less than his willingness to risk his life for railroad wages. They worked for $2.50 a day when wages were paid, which became increasingly rare as the railroad company diverted funds to stockholders rather than supporting remote work crews. The diverse crew spoke in a mixture of languages and dialects, creating a babel of voices that somehow managed to coordinate the dangerous work of mountain railroad construction. Leading this desperate band of laborers was Samuel Hartwell, a former Union Army quartermaster whose organizational skills had impressed railroad executives in Omaha during a brief meeting where he'd outlined his theories on managing large crews under adverse conditions. At 43, Hartwell carried the bearing of a military man, with steel-gray hair and penetrating eyes that seemed to catalog every detail around him, from the daily tonnage of rock moved to the subtle signs of discontent among his workers. His military experience had taught him that successful leadership required maintaining authority through a combination of respect and fear, a lesson that would prove tragically relevant during the coming winter. Beside him worked his assistant foreman Thomas Kincaid, a Dublin-born giant who stood nearly 6.5 feet tall and could swing a 20-pound sledgehammer for 12 hours straight while still having energy to break up fights in the evening. Kincaid had earned his position through a combination of raw physical strength and an intuitive understanding of worker psychology that allowed him to diffuse tensions before they erupted into violence. His massive hands, scarred from years of manual labor, could be gentle enough to bandage a minor injury or brutal enough to discipline a troublemaker, depending on the situation's requirements. The camp's cook, Wilhelm Brenner, had followed the pattern of German immigration west from Pennsylvania, bringing with him an impressive knowledge of preserving meat and stretching meager provisions to feed large crews during his service with a Pennsylvania regiment that had spent months under siege conditions during the war. Brenner's pale blue eyes held an intensity that some workers found unsettling, and his habit of studying each man's physical condition with the calculating gaze of a butcher evaluating livestock had been noticed but dismissed as professional thoroughness. His cook tent was organized with military precision, every knife sharp enough to shave with, and every pot scrubbed to a gleaming finish that reflected his obsessive attention to cleanliness and efficiency. By October 1867, signs of trouble were already emerging like cracks in a dam that would eventually burst with catastrophic force. Supply trains that should have arrived weekly began arriving sporadically, sometimes 2 or 3 weeks apart, carrying partial loads that seemed to have been picked over before reaching Camp 17. The railroad company, facing financial pressure from investors concerned about cost overruns and government oversight of their subsidy claims, had quietly begun diverting supply shipments to camps closer to civilization, leaving remote outposts like Camp 17 to fend for themselves with whatever scraps remained after more accessible crews had been supplied. When confronted by telegraph about the supply shortages, company executives in Omaha sent back terse responses about temporary logistics adjustments and assured camp leadership that full provisions would resume shortly pending resolution of transportation difficulties. The responses carried an undertone of barely concealed irritation, as if the mountain workers were being unreasonably demanding by expecting regular food deliveries during a harsh Utah winter. The men began supplementing their dwindling rations by hunting the few deer and elk that remained in the area, but game had been largely driven away by months of constant blasting and construction noise that echoed through the valleys like continuous thunder. The local wildlife had either fled to quieter regions or been killed off by previous hunting expeditions, leaving the surrounding mountains as barren of animal life as they were of human habitation. By November, the standard daily ration had been reduced from 3 meals to 2, then to 1 meal, plus whatever the men could forage from the increasingly barren landscape that offered little beyond pine needles and bitter mountain herbs. Tempers flared as hunger gnawed at the crew like a constant, grinding pain that made every small irritation feel like a major insult. Fights broke out over card games and perceived slights that would have been laughed off under normal circumstances, with men who had previously worked together harmoniously suddenly viewing each other as competitors for scarce resources. The evening gatherings around the cookfires, once filled with songs and stories from the old country, became tense affairs where workers eyed each other's portions and counted every bite with the calculating attention of accountants tracking valuable assets. Yet even as conditions deteriorated with each passing day, the pressure from company headquarters to maintain construction schedules never let up, arriving in daily telegrams that demanded progress reports and threatened wage cuts or replacement by other crews if productivity declined. Daily quotas for track laying and rock removal remained unchanged despite the reduced workforce efficiency caused by malnutrition and the increasing difficulty of working in sub-freezing temperatures that made metal tools painful to handle and turned exhaled breath into clouds of ice crystals that obscured vision. The men found themselves trapped between the advancing winter that grew more brutal with each passing week, diminishing food supplies that seemed to shrink regardless of careful rationing, and corporate masters who seemed utterly disconnected from the reality of mountain construction work. The company's demands felt like messages from another planet, written by men who had never felt the bite of mountain wind or the exhaustion of swinging a pickaxe at granite while fighting altitude sickness and chronic hunger. The first death came on November 23, 1867, during what should have been a routine blasting operation in the granite face that had been resisting their efforts for nearly 2 weeks. Patrick Sullivan, a 24-year-old from County Cork, whose cheerful disposition had made him popular among the Irish workers, was positioning charges in a crevice when a premature explosion brought down several tons of rock in a thunderous cascade that shook the entire valley. The blast occurred without warning, suggesting either a defective fuse or contaminated powder, though the exact cause would never be determined due to the destruction of physical evidence. Sullivan's screams echoed through the mountain air for nearly an hour, growing progressively weaker as shock and blood loss took their toll. But when the crew finally managed to clear enough debris to reach him, they found his body crushed beyond recognition. Every bone had been shattered by the immense weight of falling granite, organs pulverized into a gruesome paste that stained the rocks around him with dark patches that would remain visible for weeks. His face, once animated by an infectious smile that could lighten the mood of the entire crew, was now unrecognizable, transformed into something that barely resembled human features. What happened next would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives, though few would ever speak of it publicly or even acknowledge their memories in private conversations. As the men stood around Sullivan's mangled remains in stunned silence, discussing the grim practicalities of burial in ground that had been frozen solid for weeks, Cook Wilhelm Brenner stepped forward with an expression that several witnesses later described as curious rather than horrified. His pale eyes studied the wreckage with the same professional attention he usually reserved for examining sides of beef delivered by the supply trains. Brenner knelt beside the body, his weathered hands moving with surprising gentleness as he examined the extent of the damage and calculated what portions might still be salvageable despite the traumatic injuries. His assessment was conducted with the methodical precision of a man who had spent years evaluating meat quality under various conditions, from battlefield casualties to livestock slaughtered under less than ideal circumstances. "There's still good meat here," Brenner announced in his thick German accent, his words cutting through the mountain air like a knife blade through silence. "Waste not, want not, that's what we learned during the siege of Vicksburg when we had to make every scrap count." The assembled workers stared in stunned silence as Brenner began efficiently separating usable flesh from the damaged areas, his butcher's knife moving with practiced precision that spoke of years spent processing various types of meat under pressure. "This boy gave his life for the railroad," Brenner continued matter-of-factly, never pausing in his grisly examination. "Least we can do is not let him feed the wolves and bears that prowl these mountains looking for easy meals." His voice carried no trace of madness or desperation, only the practical tone of a professional solving a logistical problem with the tools and resources available. Thomas Kincaid was the first to voice what everyone was thinking, his massive frame trembling slightly as he struggled to process what he was witnessing. "Jesus Christ, Wilhelm, you can't be serious about this madness." But Brenner's pale blue eyes held no trace of insanity or moral confusion, only the calculating look of a man solving a practical problem with the efficiency that had made him valuable to the railroad company. "I've served horse meat to cavalry units, rat stew to siege survivors, and boiled leather to men who would have died otherwise," Brenner replied, never pausing in his systematic work. "This is fresher than anything we've had in weeks, and Patrick here was a healthy young man who took good care of himself." The cook's voice carried an almost pedagogical tone, as if he were explaining basic principles of nutrition and resource management to students who had failed to grasp obvious concepts. Samuel Hartwell faced the most crucial decision of his life, one that would define not only his own fate, but the destiny of every man under his command. As foreman, he possessed the authority to put a stop to Brenner's proposal immediately, but he was also acutely aware that their last supply train was now 3 weeks overdue, Their remaining provisions would last perhaps another 10 days if carefully rationed, and the weather reports from passing telegraph operators suggested the mountain passes would remain impassable until April at the earliest. The railroad company had effectively abandoned them to their fate. Winter was tightening its grip on the mountains like a giant fist closing around their isolated camp. And 126 men were looking to him for leadership that might keep them alive until spring brought relief. The weight of command had never felt heavier than it did in that moment, standing over Sullivan's broken body while his starving crew waited for a decision that would either preserve their humanity or ensure their survival. The silence stretched for what felt like hours as the men waited for Hartwell's decision, their breath forming clouds of vapor in the frigid air, while snow began falling in large, soft flakes that would soon cover Sullivan's blood-stained corpse. Finally, Hartwell gave a barely perceptible nod, and Brenner resumed his work with renewed efficiency and what might have been the faintest hint of satisfaction in his pale eyes. Within 2 hours, portions of Patrick Sullivan had joined the evening stew, mixed with their dwindling supply of potatoes and onions to mask both the texture and taste of what they were consuming. Brenner had worked with remarkable skill to disguise the meat's origin, seasoning it heavily with wild herbs he claimed to have found near the partially frozen stream and cutting it into small pieces that could be mistaken for game meat by men hungry enough to avoid asking uncomfortable questions. Most of the men claimed they couldn't bring themselves to eat the stew, standing around the cook fires with their bowls untouched while they wrestled with moral objections that seemed increasingly abstract compared to the immediate reality of their empty stomachs. But by morning, every bowl had been scraped clean, and several workers quietly asked Brenner if there might be more of the same mountain game available for future meals. That night, several workers reported hearing sounds from the cook tent that would become horribly familiar over the coming weeks. The rhythmic thunk of cleaver against cutting board, the scrape of knife against bone, and Brenner's voice humming old German folk songs as he worked through the night processing what remained of their former companion. The sounds continued until nearly dawn, accompanied by the crackling of fires and the occasional splash of water as Brenner cleaned his tools and work surfaces with the same meticulous attention to hygiene that had characterized his cooking throughout the construction season. When the men emerged for breakfast the next morning, they found their usual porridge supplemented with what Brenner called mountain sausage, densely packed links with a texture none of them recognized, but a taste that satisfied their growing hunger more completely than anything they'd eaten in weeks. The sausage had been seasoned and spiced so skillfully that it bore no resemblance to its grim source, and several workers complimented the cook on his ability to create such satisfying fare from their limited resources. The transformation of Camp 17 began gradually, almost imperceptibly, like a slow poison working its way through the collective soul of the work crew until it had infected every aspect of their daily existence. Within days of Sullivan's death, the men noticed that their energy levels had improved dramatically despite the harsh conditions that should have been sapping their strength. The constant gnawing hunger that had plagued them for weeks seemed to have vanished, replaced by a sense of satisfaction and physical vigor that none of them had felt since early autumn when supplies were still arriving regularly. Wilhelm Brenner, meanwhile, had taken on an almost mystical authority within the camp hierarchy that extended far beyond his official role as cook. Men who had previously dismissed him as just another immigrant tradesman now sought his approval and advice on matters ranging from work assignments to personal disputes, treating his opinions with the deference typically reserved for religious leaders or military commanders. He moved through the camp with a new confidence that bordered on arrogance, his pale eyes studying each worker with the same calculating assessment he had once reserved for cuts of meat delivered by the supply trains. When asked about his seemingly endless ability to stretch their provisions and maintain the crew's improved nutrition despite the ongoing supply crisis, Brenner would simply smile and tap his temple with one weathered finger. "Waste not, want not," he would repeat like a mantra. There's always more where you'd least expect it, if you know how to look and aren't squeamish about taking advantage of opportunities when they present themselves. The second death occurred on December 7th, when veteran railroad worker Marcus Holloway suffered what appeared to be a massive heart attack while hauling timber from the cutting area to the construction site. Unlike Sullivan's gruesome demise under tons of granite, Holloway's death was clean and peaceful. The 40-year-old Ohio native simply dropped his load mid-step, clutched his chest with both hands, and collapsed to the frozen ground where he died within minutes despite the efforts of Dr. Edwin Cartwright to revive him. Holloway had been a steady, reliable worker whose experience with railroad construction dated back to the early expansion projects in the Midwest, making his sudden death a genuine shock to his fellow workers who had come to depend on his knowledge and leadership in technical matters. His loss represented not just another mouth to feed, but the elimination of valuable expertise that would be difficult to replace in their isolated circumstances. But this time, there was no debate about what to do with the body, no shocked silence or moral wrestling with unthinkable options. Before anyone could suggest alternatives like burial or preservation until spring, Brenner was already sharpening his knives with the methodical care of a craftsman preparing for important work. The cook's response had become so routine that several workers began helping him transport the body to his processing area without being asked, as if they were simply following established protocol for handling workplace fatalities. Marcus was a good worker who understood the value of efficiency, Brenner announced as he began his familiar routine, his hands moving with increased skill and speed that spoke of recent practice. He'd want to keep helping the crew even now, contributing to our survival in the only way that's still possible for him. The men watched with a mixture of horror and fascination as Brenner worked, noting his increasing expertise in the grim art of human butchery and the almost artistic precision with which he separated useful meat from less desirable portions. What had taken him hours with Sullivan's mangled corpse required barely 1 hour with Holloway's intact body, and the results were noticeably superior in both quantity and quality. Brenner had developed techniques for maximizing the yield from each victim, utilizing organs and portions that might have been discarded during his earlier, less experienced efforts. His growing expertise was evident in every aspect of the process, from the efficiency of his cutting to the creative ways he disguised the final product. More disturbing than Brenner's technical improvement was the crew's growing acceptance of their new dietary reality, which had evolved from desperate necessity to something approaching enthusiasm. When the evening stew was served, seasoned with wild herbs that Brenner claimed to have found near the frozen stream, but which some suspected he was cultivating in secret locations around the camp, the men ate with genuine appetite rather than the forced necessity they had felt before. Some workers even complimented the cook on the improved flavor and texture of their enhanced rations, praising his ability to make their special provisions taste better with each preparation and asking if he might be able to obtain more of the same high-quality ingredients. The psychological distance between their former lives and their current reality had widened to the point where they could discuss cannibalism in the euphemistic language of restaurant patrons evaluating a particularly successful meal. But foreman Samuel Hartwell was beginning to notice patterns that troubled him deeply, even as he recognized his own complicity in establishing the system that made those patterns possible. The deaths, which had initially seemed like unfortunate accidents typical of dangerous railroad construction work, were occurring with suspicious regularity. Roughly every 10 to 12 days, just as their enhanced rations were beginning to run low and the men started showing signs of renewed hunger and decreased energy. More disturbing still was the subtle change in how the men interacted with each other during work hours and evening gatherings. Conversations had become guarded and calculating, with workers eyeing their companions not as fellow laborers sharing common hardships, but as potential threats to their own survival, or potential resources for addressing future food shortages. The easy camaraderie that had once characterized the crew's relationships had been replaced by a constant state of wariness that made every interaction feel like a negotiation. The third death, that of Irish immigrant Seamus O'Brien on December 19th, removed any lingering doubts about the trajectory their isolated community was following and marked the point where accident gave way to deliberate action. O'Brien, a typically robust 28-year-old who had never shown signs of illness or weakness, allegedly slipped on ice while carrying blasting powder from the storage area to the work site and struck his head on a granite outcropping with enough force to cause fatal injuries. The injury was severe but not immediately fatal, yet when his fellow workers found him 20 minutes later, O'Brien was dead, his skull crushed by what appeared to be repeated blows from a heavy instrument rather than a single impact from falling. The blood spatter pattern and the condition of the alleged ice patch told a story that contradicted the official explanation, but no one seemed interested in conducting a thorough investigation. Thomas Kincaid, investigating the scene with the thoroughness his position required, discovered that the ice patch where O'Brien supposedly slipped showed no signs of disturbance that would be consistent with a fall. And the blood spatter pattern suggested the fatal injuries had occurred while the victim was lying on the ground, rather than standing upright. The evidence pointed clearly toward deliberate murder, but when Kincaid brought these observations to Hartwell, the foreman's response was telling in its brevity and finality. Hartwell ordered Kincaid to keep his suspicions to himself and help Brenner prepare the evening meal, making it clear that official investigations into workplace accidents were less important than maintaining crew morale and ensuring adequate nutrition during the difficult winter months. The foreman's decision marked the point where leadership shifted from maintaining order to actively participating in systematic murder. That night, as the men gathered around their cook fires with unusual enthusiasm and anticipation, a horrible realization began crystallizing in the minds of the few who still retained enough moral clarity to see what was happening to their community. They were no longer survivors adapting to desperate circumstances with regrettable but necessary compromises. They had become participants in systematic murder, with each death carefully timed to maintain their food supply through the long mountain winter that stretched ahead like an eternity of hunger and cold. The isolation of Camp 17 during the winter of 1867-68 created a laboratory for human degradation that would have horrified even the most hardened observers of frontier brutality, transforming ordinary working men into something that challenged the basic assumptions of civilized society. As December faded into January with no sign of rescue or resupply, the remaining 124 workers had settled into a routine that combined backbreaking labor with carefully orchestrated death, all overseen by the increasingly powerful trio of Hartwell, Kincaid, and Brenner, who had assumed roles that went far beyond their official positions. The selection process had become almost ritualistic in its precision and deliberate cruelty. Every 10 days, Brenner would appear at the morning meal with what he called his nutrition assessment, a clipboard and pencil in hand as he carefully studied each worker's physical condition, productivity levels, and, most chillingly, their social connections within the group. Workers who kept to themselves, who had no close friends among the crew, or who showed signs of weakness or illness, found themselves assigned to the most dangerous tasks with an efficiency that suggested careful planning rather than random chance. The assignments seemed reasonable on the surface. Handling unstable explosives that required steady hands and clear thinking, working alone in unstable tunnel sections where cave-ins were common, or maintaining equipment near the treacherous cliff edges where a single misstep could result in a fatal fall. But the pattern was unmistakable to anyone who paid attention. The men selected for these dangerous duties were invariably those who would be least missed by their fellow workers and whose deaths would cause the minimum disruption to camp morale. What made the system so insidiously effective was its veneer of practical necessity and professional competence. When 23-year-old German immigrant Friedrich Köhler was found dead at the bottom of a ravine on January 2nd, allegedly having fallen while checking survey markers in an area known for unstable footing, his death was treated as another tragic accident in an inherently dangerous profession. Köhler had been isolated within the camp due to language barriers and cultural differences, making him an ideal candidate for elimination according to Brenner's utilitarian calculus. Brenner's immediate response to each death had become so routine that none of the workers even questioned it anymore, accepting his presence at accident scenes as natural as a doctor responding to medical emergencies. The cook would arrive with his specialized tools and begin his grisly work with an efficiency that suggested extensive experience, processing each victim with techniques that had been refined through practice and experimentation. The psychological transformation of the camp was perhaps more disturbing than the physical acts of cannibalism, representing a complete breakdown of the social bonds that had held the crew together during the early months of construction. Men who had once shared stories of their families back home, trading photographs and letters from loved ones during evening gatherings, now spoke only of work schedules and equipment maintenance with the mechanical precision of factory workers rather than human beings. The evening gatherings around the cook fires, once filled with songs and jokes that helped maintain morale during difficult times, had become silent affairs where workers consumed their enhanced rations with the mechanical efficiency of animals feeding at a trough. Trust had been replaced by a constant state of wariness, with each man calculating his own value to the group and assessing potential threats from his companions while trying to avoid behaviors that might mark him for elimination. Thomas Kincaid had embraced his role as chief enforcer with an enthusiasm that surprised even Samuel Hartwell, who had initially viewed the Dublin giant as a useful subordinate rather than a true partner in their enterprise. Kincaid seemed to take genuine pleasure in the selection process, approaching potential victims with the same methodical patience he had once applied to railroad construction tasks, studying their habits and weaknesses with the focused attention of a predator choosing prey. When young Irish immigrant Daniel McCarthy began showing signs of exhaustion and malnutrition in mid-January, displaying the hollow-eyed look and trembling hands that marked him as a liability to the crew's productivity, Kincaid appointed himself McCarthy's constant companion and helper. The assistant foreman offered assistance with heavy lifting and provided seemingly genuine friendship during a time when social isolation could be fatal, creating a false sense of security that made the eventual betrayal more effective. 3 days later, McCarthy was found crushed beneath a load of timber that had allegedly shifted during transport from the cutting area to the construction site, with Kincaid conveniently present to witness the accident and help extract the body from beneath the heavy logs. The timing was perfect, occurring just as the camp's enhanced food supplies were running low and the men were beginning to show signs of renewed hunger and decreased energy. The camp's medical officer, Dr. Edwin Cartwright, had initially attempted to document what he suspected were deliberate killings, maintaining detailed notes about the circumstances surrounding each death and the inconsistencies in the official explanations. His medical training had taught him to observe evidence objectively and draw logical conclusions from physical facts, making him potentially dangerous to the system that Hartwell and his associates had established. But by late January, even Cartwright had succumbed to the prevailing madness that had infected every aspect of camp life. His medical oath overwhelmed by the brutal pragmatism of survival and the psychological pressure of prolonged isolation. When he examined the body of railroad worker Giuseppe Bellacorte on January 24th, another alleged accident victim whose injuries were inconsistent with the described circumstances, Cartwright simply noted "death by misadventure" in his log and helped Brenner transport the corpse to the cook tent without conducting the thorough investigation that his training demanded. The most chilling aspect of Camp 17's transformation was how completely normal the systematic murder and cannibalism had begun to feel to the surviving workers, who had adapted to their new reality with a psychological flexibility that would have been impossible to imagine under normal circumstances. Men who had once been horrified by the prospect of consuming human flesh now eagerly anticipated mealtimes, gathering around the cook fires with genuine enthusiasm, while praising Brenner's culinary innovations and even making specific requests for particular preparations. The cook had developed an extensive repertoire of techniques for disguising the taste and texture of human meat. incorporating wild seasonings and creative combinations that made their grim rations not just palatable, but genuinely appetizing to men whose moral compass had been completely destroyed by hunger and desperation. Brenner's creativity in the kitchen had become a source of pride within the camp, with workers competing to offer compliments and suggestions for future meals as if they were guests at a fine restaurant rather than participants in systematic cannibalism. The first crack in the carefully constructed facade of Camp 17's cannibalistic society appeared in early February, when Polish immigrant Kazimierz Kowalski made a discovery that would ultimately provide the most comprehensive record of the winter's atrocities. Kowalski, a former university student who had emigrated to America following political troubles in his homeland, possessed both the education and moral clarity necessary to document what was happening around him with scientific precision. While searching for usable materials in the abandoned equipment shed, Kowalski discovered a cache of personal belongings that told the true story of the camp's diminishing population. Watches, wedding rings, family photographs, and personal letters from dozens of workers who had allegedly wandered off or died in accidents were hidden beneath loose floorboards, creating a grim museum of the dead that contradicted every official explanation for their disappearances. Among the most damning evidence were detailed notes in Brenner's handwriting that catalogued each victim's physical characteristics, estimated meat yield, and preparation methods with the clinical precision of a scientific study. The cook had been conducting experiments in human butchery, refining his techniques and keeping careful records of which approaches produced the best results in terms of both quantity and palatability. Kowalski began maintaining his own secret record of events, writing in a mixture of Polish and English to avoid detection while documenting the systematic nature of the murders and the psychological transformation of his fellow workers. His diary entries provide chilling insights into the daily life of a community that had abandoned every principle of civilized behavior in favor of carefully organized survival cannibalism. February 8th. They took Michelson today, Kowalski wrote in one entry. The poor Swedish boy never had a chance once Kincaid marked him for selection. Found him this morning with his skull crushed, same as the others. Brenner was already sharpening his knives before the body was cold. We'll eat well tonight, and tomorrow the cycle begins again with someone else marked for death. The discovery of additional evidence began to reveal the true scope of the conspiracy that had taken control of Camp 17. Hidden among Hartwell's papers, Kowalski found correspondence with railroad company officials that suggested the foreman had been reporting false information about the camp's population and condition, claiming that missing workers had deserted rather than died, thus avoiding any corporate responsibility for their fate. More disturbing still were indications that the systematic cannibalism had been planned rather than arising spontaneously from desperate circumstances. References to alternative food sources and creative resource management in early correspondence suggested that company officials were aware of what was happening and had chosen to ignore it rather than risk the expense and negative publicity of a rescue operation. By February 1868, the systematic nature of the killings had created an atmosphere of such pervasive terror that the remaining 87 workers had effectively segregated themselves into two distinct groups: the inner circle of Hartwell, Kincaid, Brenner, and their most trusted allies, who openly discussed their feeding schedule and victim selection criteria, and the increasingly desperate outer circle of workers who understood exactly what was happening but felt powerless to stop it or escape from their mountain prison. The inner circle had developed elaborate justifications for their actions that went far beyond simple survival, creating a pseudo-intellectual framework that transformed murder and cannibalism into acts of rational resource management. During evening meetings in Hartwell's quarters, they spoke of their work in terms of natural selection and social Darwinism, arguing that they were creating a superior workforce by eliminating the weak and inefficient members of their community. Brenner, whose education had included some exposure to scientific theories popular in European universities, provided pseudo-intellectual backing for their cannibalistic practices with lectures on nutrition and human physiology that claimed consuming the flesh of fellow humans provided superior protein and even psychological benefits. "We're becoming something stronger than ordinary men," Brenner explained to his increasingly devoted followers during one particularly chilling gathering in early February. "Each man we process makes us more resilient, more capable of surviving conditions that would destroy workers who cling to outdated moral restrictions." The group had begun keeping detailed records of their meals that went far beyond simple documentation, noting which victims had provided the most satisfactory nutrition, which preparation methods yielded the best results, and even recording the psychological effects of consuming different types of human flesh. Brenner had even begun experimenting with preservation techniques borrowed from his military experience, smoking and salting human flesh to create supplies that could last longer between kills and provide variety in their diet. The outer circle, meanwhile, lived in constant terror of being selected for the next accident, knowing that any sign of weakness or social isolation could mark them for death. Workers began sleeping in shifts, with trusted companions keeping watch through the night while others rested, creating an atmosphere of paranoia and sleeplessness that further weakened their physical and mental resistance to the horror surrounding them. Some attempted to form alliances for mutual protection, but these efforts were consistently undermined by the harsh reality that any group large enough to resist the inner circle would also be large enough to threaten the food supply that was keeping everyone alive through the mountain winter. The mathematics of survival had created an impossible situation where cooperation meant starvation and resistance meant immediate death. The breaking point came on February 14th, when Irish worker Brian Donnelly attempted to organize an armed resistance against what he called the murdering bastards who've turned us into monsters worse than any wild animal. Donnelly had managed to convince 12 other workers to join his rebellion, appealing to their remaining humanity and their memories of the moral men they had once been before hunger and desperation had transformed them into something unrecognizable. The rebels had begun stockpiling weapons and supplies for a confrontation with Hartwell's group, planning to overthrow the cannibalistic leadership and either attempt escape through the mountain passes or establish a more humane system of survival until rescue arrived. But their planning was discovered by Brenner's network of informants, men who had become so psychologically dependent on the cannibalistic system that they viewed any threat to it as a threat to their own survival. The confrontation was swift and brutal, occurring during the pre-dawn hours when most of the camp was asleep and unable to witness or interfere with the violence. Kincaid led a group of loyalists in a coordinated attack on Donnelly's hiding place, claiming later that the rebels had attacked first and forced them to defend themselves in what appeared to be a desperate fight for survival. When the violence ended with the methodical efficiency of a military operation, Donnelly and 4 of his allies were dead, their bodies bearing injuries that clearly indicated deliberate execution rather than combat wounds. The remaining rebels were given a choice that perfectly illustrated the moral bankruptcy of their situation: join the inner circle as full participants in the killing and cannibalism, or be processed themselves as the next meal. 7 of the 8 surviving rebels chose integration, abandoning any pretense of moral resistance in favor of guaranteed survival that required them to participate actively in selecting and killing their former companions. Only one man, Kazimierz Kowalski, refused to participate directly in the murders, though he continued to consume the human flesh that sustained the camp through his detailed documentation of events, creating a compromise position that made him invaluable as a chronicler while keeping him barely alive. Kowalski's detailed diary, discovered decades later in the effects of his grandson, provides the most comprehensive account of Camp 17's descent into systematic cannibalism, and reveals the psychological mechanisms that allowed ordinary men to become enthusiastic participants in ritualized murder. His entries describe a community where the normal boundaries between civilization and savagery had been completely erased, replaced by a new social order based entirely on the efficient production and consumption of human flesh. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Camp 17 intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in this tale of survival and savagery in the Utah wilderness. The Inner Circle's complete control over Camp 17 was cemented by the establishment of what they called the roster, a formal schedule of victims that extended through the remainder of the winter, organized with the same attention to detail that Hartwell had once applied to railroad construction schedules. Workers were ranked according to their usefulness, social connections, and perceived loyalty to the new order, creating a hierarchy where everyone knew their approximate position on the list of future meals. Those at the bottom of the roster knew they had perhaps days or weeks to live, while those at the top enjoyed the privilege of participating in the selection of future victims and helping to maintain the system that kept them temporarily safe. The psychological effect was devastating, as men who had once been friends and colleagues now viewed each other primarily in terms of their relative position on the death list and their potential value as food sources. The true horror of Camp 17 became apparent not just in the systematic nature of the killings, but in the elaborate infrastructure that had been created to support and conceal the cannibalistic operation. By mid-February, Brenner had transformed his cook tent into a sophisticated processing facility that rivaled professional slaughterhouses in its efficiency and organization, complete with specialized tools for different aspects of human butchery and preservation techniques that ensured maximum utilization of each victim. The cook had developed a complex system for categorizing human meat based on the victim's age, physical condition, and cause of death, with different preparation methods applied to optimize both nutritional value and palatability. Younger victims provided more tender meat that required minimal seasoning, while older workers yielded tougher flesh that benefited from slow cooking methods and careful spicing to mask any undesirable flavors or textures. Most disturbing of all was the discovery that Brenner had been conducting systematic experiments in human nutrition, testing theories about which organs provided the greatest energy, which preparation methods preserved the most vitamins, and even whether consuming specific body parts might confer psychological or physical benefits to the cannibals. His notes revealed a scientific approach to anthropophagy that transformed murder into research and elevated cannibalism to the level of a medical discipline. The camp's transformation had attracted the attention of wildlife that normally avoided human settlements, with wolves and bears drawn by the constant smell of cooking meat and the disposal of unusable body parts in remote areas of the valley. Workers reported seeing larger and more aggressive scavengers than usual, suggesting that the ecosystem itself had been altered by the camp's activities and that evidence of their crimes might persist long after the winter ended. Samuel Hartwell had meanwhile established communication protocols with railroad company officials that involved systematic deception about the camp's actual condition and population. His telegrams reported fictional progress on construction projects, claimed that missing workers had deserted for better opportunities elsewhere, and described weather conditions and supply needs that bore little resemblance to reality. The correspondence suggests a deliberate effort to prevent any rescue attempts or investigations that might expose what was happening in the mountain camp. More sinister still were indications that some company officials suspected the truth about Camp 17 but chose to ignore it, rather than face the financial and legal consequences of acknowledging systematic murder and cannibalism among their workforce. References to alternative resource management and creative problem-solving under adverse conditions in corporate correspondence suggest that executives were willing to overlook atrocities as long as they didn't become public knowledge or interfere with the railroad's expansion schedule. The psychological control exerted by the Inner Circle extended beyond simple fear of death to include sophisticated manipulation of group dynamics and individual psychology. Hartwell had implemented a system of rewards and privileges that encouraged workers to compete for favor with their cannibalistic leaders, creating incentives for betrayal and collaboration that ensured the survival of their system even among workers who might otherwise resist. Workers who demonstrated enthusiasm for the new order were given better sleeping quarters, larger food portions, and protection from selection for future meals, while those who showed reluctance or moral qualms found themselves increasingly isolated and vulnerable. The system created powerful psychological pressure to not just tolerate cannibalism, but to embrace it as a necessary and even beneficial adaptation to their circumstances. The final collapse of any pretense of civilization at Camp 17 began on March 3, 1868, when the long-awaited supply train finally appeared on the horizon, struggling through the mountain passes with provisions that could have saved dozens of lives if delivered months earlier. The sight of the approaching locomotive should have been cause for celebration among the survivors, but instead it created a crisis within the camp's leadership that would ultimately reveal the full extent of their moral disintegration and the impossibility of concealing their winter activities from outside observers. Samuel Hartwell called an emergency meeting of the inner circle to address what he termed the supply problem, recognizing that the arrival of railroad officials and fresh supplies would make their carefully constructed deception impossible to maintain. With outside observers about to arrive, the evidence of their winter activities would be immediately apparent to anyone with basic observational skills and a willingness to ask uncomfortable questions about the camp's dramatically reduced population. The cook tent was filled with preserved human flesh, organized with the efficiency of a commercial meat processing facility. The camp's population had been reduced from 127 to fewer than 40 survivors through systematic murder, and many of the remaining workers bore the psychological scars of months spent in a cannibalistic hell that had transformed them into something barely recognizable as and beings. The physical evidence alone would be enough to expose their crimes, but the testimony of traumatized survivors would provide details that could result in mass executions for murder and cannibalism. The solution proposed by Wilhelm Brenner was characteristically brutal and efficient, reflecting the same ruthless pragmatism that had guided his approach to human butchery throughout the winter months. "We eliminate all potential witnesses before the supply train arrives," he suggested with chilling matter-of-factness, then claimed that the missing workers deserted or died from natural causes during the harsh winter months that tested everyone's endurance. "Mountain winters are unforgiving and claim many lives," Brenner continued, his pale eyes reflecting the calculating intelligence that had made him so effective at organizing systematic murder. "No one will question a high casualty rate in such dangerous and isolated conditions, especially if the survivors present a unified account of events that emphasizes natural disasters and unfortunate accidents rather than deliberate violence." The plan required the elimination of approximately 30 additional workers in less than 24 hours. A massacre that would dwarf anything they had attempted previously and require coordination and ruthlessness that would test even their hardened commitment to survival through murder. But the alternative, exposure, trial, and certain execution for their crimes, made mass murder seem like the only rational choice for men who had already abandoned every moral principle that might have guided their decision-making. Hartwell recognized that the success of Brenner's plan would require the active participation of every member of the inner circle, creating collective guilt that would ensure everyone's silence and commitment to maintaining their fictional account of events. "We're all in this together now," he announced to his assembled followers. "Either we all survive by eliminating the evidence, or we all hang together for what we've done during this winter." The massacre began at dawn on March 5th, just hours before the supply train was scheduled to reach Camp 17, with the inner circle moving through the camp systematically and killing sleeping workers in their bunks with hammers, axes, and whatever weapons they could gather. The victims had no warning and little opportunity to resist, having been weakened by months of malnutrition and psychological trauma that had left them defenseless against their former companions who had maintained their strength through human flesh. Kazimierz Kowalski's diary provides a horrifying account of those final hours that reads like a descent into hell, orchestrated by men who had completely abandoned their humanity. The screaming started just after sunrise, echoing off the mountain walls like the cries of the damned. I heard Brenner's voice shouting orders, telling his men to clean up efficiently and leave no witnesses who might compromise our story. From my hiding place behind the supply shed, I watched them drag bodies to the cook fires, working with the same methodical precision they had used all winter. But this time, they weren't preparing food. They were destroying evidence of the most systematic campaign of murder I have ever witnessed. The plan was to burn everything that could implicate them in deliberate murder and cannibalism, then present themselves as the heroic survivors of a winter that had claimed the lives of their less fortunate companions through a combination of accidents, disease, desertion, and the harsh natural conditions that characterized mountain railroad construction. But the systematic nature of their crimes had created logistical problems that even Brenner's organizational skills couldn't solve in the limited time available. The sheer volume of human remains, both processed and unprocessed, was too great to eliminate completely in the hours available before the supply train's arrival, and the physical evidence of their processing facility would be difficult to explain to investigators who possessed any level of forensic knowledge. Additionally, the psychological condition of the surviving workers made it unlikely that they could maintain consistent stories under questioning by experienced railroad detectives who were trained to identify deception and inconsistency. As the supply train's whistle echoed through the valley, announcing its imminent arrival and the end of their isolation, the inner circle made a desperate decision that would ultimately doom them all rather than provide the salvation they sought. Rather than risk exposure of their cannibalistic activities, they would claim that the camp had been attacked by hostile Indians, with the missing workers killed in the fighting and their bodies carried off by the attackers in accordance with tribal customs that would explain the absence of remains. This explanation would account for the dramatically reduced population while deflecting suspicion about cannibalism, and it fit with contemporary assumptions about Indian warfare that would make it believable to railroad officials who were already predisposed to blame Native Americans for problems encountered during westward expansion. The story would also justify the survivors' traumatized condition and their reluctance to discuss details of their ordeal. The arriving railroad officials found 18 survivors huddled in the supply shed, their stories carefully coordinated to support the Indian attack narrative that would supposedly explain the disappearance of 109 workers during the brutal mountain winter. Samuel Hartwell, his military bearing intact despite months of cannibalistic brutality, delivered a compelling account of siege conditions and heroic resistance that initially satisfied the investigators, who were more concerned with resuming construction than conducting thorough forensic analysis. Wilhelm Brenner, his cook tent hastily cleaned and reorganized to conceal evidence of human processing, explained the abundance of preserved meat as successful hunting and careful rationing during the winter months, displaying the same professional competence that had made him valuable to the railroad company before his descent into systematic cannibalism. His calm demeanor and detailed knowledge of food preservation techniques made his explanation seem credible to officials who had no reason to suspect the truth about their survival methods. But the investigators were more thorough than the survivors had anticipated, particularly Company Detective Harrison Vale, a former Union Army intelligence officer whose experience with military investigations had taught him to recognize inconsistencies and deception even among traumatized witnesses. Vale noted discrepancies in the survivors' stories and began conducting separate interviews with individual workers, applying psychological pressure that revealed cracks in their carefully rehearsed narrative. Under persistent questioning, several members of the outer circle broke down and revealed fragments of the truth, describing the systematic murders and cannibalism that had sustained the camp through the winter months. Their testimonies painted a picture of horror that went far beyond anything the investigators had imagined possible. transforming what had appeared to be a tragic but understandable survival story into evidence of the most systematic campaign of murder and cannibalism in American frontier history. The discovery of Kowalski's hidden diary provided the final piece of evidence that would condemn the Camp 17 survivors and expose the full scope of their crimes. His detailed documentation of the killing schedule, victim selection process, and the inner circle's planning sessions painted a picture of premeditated murder and cannibalism so systematic that it challenged everything the railroad company thought they knew about frontier survival and human nature under extreme conditions. The official investigation into Camp 17 was completed within 2 weeks of the supply train's arrival, but the railroad company's response reveals the true priorities of America's industrial expansion during the post-Civil War era. Rather than pursuing criminal prosecution for what was clearly systematic murder and cannibalism involving over 100 victims, Union Pacific executives chose to suppress all evidence of the incident, fearing that public knowledge of the events would damage their reputation and interfere with ongoing government subsidies that were essential to the company's financial survival. The 18 survivors were quietly transferred to different work sites across the Western Territories with strict confidentiality agreements that prohibited them from discussing their experiences at Camp 17 under penalty of criminal prosecution for violation of company secrets. Samuel Hartwell was promoted to a comfortable desk job in Omaha, where company officials could monitor his activities and ensure his continued silence about events that could destroy the railroad's public image and federal support. Thomas Kincaid disappeared entirely from railroad records within weeks of the investigation's conclusion, though some evidence suggests he was provided with substantial funds to establish a new identity in California, where he could live comfortably without the risk of revealing company secrets. Wilhelm Brenner's fate remains unknown, but shipping records indicate that a man matching his description and carrying substantial cash-booked passage to South America shortly after the investigation concluded, suggesting that the company facilitated his escape to ensure his permanent silence. The families of the missing 109 workers were given standardized letters claiming their loved ones had died in weather-related accidents and Indian attacks during the harsh mountain winter, with small compensation payments intended to discourage further investigation into circumstances that the company claimed were classified for national security reasons. Company officials systematically destroyed all records related to Camp 17, including personnel files, supply manifests, and telegraph communications that might have revealed the systematic abandonment of the work crew and the company's knowledge of subsequent events. Kazimierz Kowalski, whose diary had provided crucial evidence of the crimes and whose testimony had exposed the systematic nature of the cannibalistic murders, suffered what was officially described as a complete nervous breakdown following his cooperation with the investigation. He was committed to an asylum in Chicago, where he died 3 years later under circumstances that remain suspicious, and which some evidence suggests involved deliberate poisoning to ensure his permanent silence. His diary, however, had been secretly copied by Detective Harrison Vale, who retained the documents as insurance against potential company retaliation and as evidence of corporate crimes that might someday be prosecuted if political conditions changed. Vale's copy of the diary, discovered after his death in 1889, provides the most comprehensive account of Camp 17's transformation from a railroad construction site into a systematic cannibalistic operation that rivaled the worst atrocities in human history. The physical evidence of Camp 17's horrors was eliminated with characteristic industrial efficiency that demonstrated the railroad company's determination to erase every trace of events that could threaten their financial interests. The worksite was officially designated as geologically unstable and abandoned, with all equipment and structures removed or destroyed through controlled explosions that eliminated any potential archaeological evidence of the winter's activities. By 1870, no trace remained of the camp where 109 workers had died to feed their companions through one of the most brutal winters in Utah's recorded history. and the location had been removed from official railroad maps and survey records to prevent future investigation by historians or curiosity seekers who might ask uncomfortable questions about the missing construction crew. The psychological impact on the survivors, however, proved impossible to suppress entirely, despite the company's best efforts to monitor and control their activities. Over the following decades, several former Camp 17 workers broke their confidentiality agreements and spoke publicly about their experiences, though their accounts were generally dismissed as the ravings of men traumatized by frontier hardships and Indian warfare, rather than credible testimony about systematic cannibalism. The pattern of unexplained deaths and disappearances among the survivors during the years following their release suggests that the railroad company took active measures to prevent further revelations about the cannibalistic winter of 1867–68, using methods that ranged from financial incentives to more permanent solutions for workers who proved unwilling to maintain their silence about company secrets. The location of Camp 17 remained unmarked and unremembered until 1923, when railroad historian Margaret Hensley uncovered references to the site in archived Union Pacific correspondence that had escaped the company's systematic destruction of evidence. Her investigation revealed the scope of the cover-up and the systematic nature of the crimes, but her attempts to publish her findings were blocked by legal challenges from the railroad company's successors, who claimed that disclosure would violate trade secrets and compromise national security. Hensley's research files, discovered after her death in 1954, provide the most comprehensive account of how industrial ambition and corporate callousness created the conditions for one of America's most horrific episodes of survival cannibalism, and how systematic cover-ups protected the perpetrators while denying justice to the families of over 100 murder victims. Today, the site of Camp 17 lies beneath the waters of a federal reservoir created by dam construction in the 1960s, ensuring that any remaining physical evidence of the winter's atrocities will remain permanently inaccessible to investigators or historians. The railroad tracks that were built with such human cost continue to carry freight through the Utah mountains, though few passengers are aware that they're traveling over what was once a landscape of systematic murder and cannibalism that challenged the basic assumptions of civilized society. The Union Pacific Railroad, now one of North America's largest transportation companies with billions in annual revenue, has never acknowledged the events at Camp 17 or offered any recognition to the families of the workers who died there, maintaining the same policy of denial and suppression that protected the company's interest during the original cover-up over a century ago. This mystery shows us that the most horrifying monsters are not supernatural creatures lurking in dark forests, but ordinary people pushed beyond the boundaries of human decency by desperation, isolation, and institutional indifference that prioritizes profit over human life. The railroad company's successful cover-up proves that corporate interests were more important than justice for the immigrant workers and war veterans who died to build America's transportation network, and that systematic murder can be concealed indefinitely when powerful institutions control the evidence and the narrative. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or are there still secrets buried beneath the waters where Camp 17 once stood? Leave your comment below and let me know if you think there might be other similar incidents that were covered up during the railroad construction era when corporate power was virtually unlimited and worker lives were considered expendable. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries about America's dark industrial past. See you in the next video.